How you guys doing tonight? I'm gonna jump in just in the interest of time, and I might cut some pieces short just if I feel like it'd be more fun to just move fast and be able to get to a place of conversation. So we'll do that. But this conversation is one I'm entering into from I think a unique angle. It's a conversation on race and privilege. I don't have my PhD in the civil rights movement. I don't have any kind of studies in mass incarceration or any number of topics. And I've never been the victim or the recipient of discrimination based on race. The closest I ever came was at the Tel Aviv airport because I look a little bit too much like what they're racially profiling for, and so I had to go to an extra security line. So I come at this conversation hopefully as humbly as possible to say that as someone who is a lover of church history and has spent a lot of time studying it, as somebody that spent the bulk of his adult life studying issues surrounding justice, that's really my passion and my background and my advanced education. And as somebody that definitely has a unique experience of living in this country and coming to it with that degree of understanding of privilege and my own personal story kind of within that. So I'm coming into it from a certain kind of place. Does that make sense? And I hope to not speak for anybody else. I'm speaking just with my voice and hope to give you some of what I've learned as I've kind of gone through the way. I am a part of a Christian grad school that's a really fun experiment. It's really trying to bring back a classical style of education to ongoing adult education, where it's not about skills training. You see, classical education was about the good, the true, and the beautiful, the flourishing of the soul, if you will, the pursuit of wisdom in the good life. After World War II, a bit of a generalization, there was an explosion of college enrollment, college education. That's really where the inflection point was for college education. And in that kind of arms race of trying to get people to come to your college versus other colleges, more and more, the focus began to be on skills training or vocation training, or how this education is going to help you get that job when you graduate and then have a starting entry salary that's higher than the competing school. I went to Clemson University. I got an engineering degree. Every year they updated what the average starting salary was, not just for engineering students, but for different kinds of engineering students, whether it be electrical, mechanical, civil engineering, etc. And in that, it's partly because you were arguing not necessarily with students, you were arguing with parents to try and say the investment you're going to make or the decision that you're helping your students make to come to our school is going to give you something that as parents you're very concerned about, a job and a certain level of income coming out of it. And as that kind of went, more and more you saw the humanities or the arts or just anything that would be under kind of the broad liberal arts category getting gobbled up in favor of more and more kind of emphasis on what the degree track was. Now that's a broad telling of a story, but I really think there's an opportunity to recapture just the heartbeat of Christian liberal arts education, what it means to truly develop our capacity to know what the right questions are, how to ask those questions, and the tools that we use to kind of evaluate different answers and what that really means for the good life or what it means for Christian discipleship. And so that's kind of a fun thing I get to do with a colleague of mine, Dave Daly, back there. And our school is a virtual campus with students all around the world and professors from all around the world, so that you really get this interchange of voices and experience and ideas. But I say that kind of just because we have a unique way of wanting to approach things both historically and theologically. And theologically is simply saying, what happens if we take account of God first and then understand the subject in relationship to God second? So instead of just asking what is justice, trying to understand God, His heart for creation, and therefore what that means about justice, right? Not just studying creativity, but realizing that God made us in His image, And it says in Genesis 1:17 that God created them, male and female, He created them in His image. He created them. The word that shows up more in that verse than any other word, and that's kind of the hallmark creation verse for humankind, is the word create. That God is a creative being, and if we're made in God's image, therefore we are fundamentally creative beings too. If you've ever said, raise your hand if you've ever said, I don't have a creative bone in my body. Somebody in this room has to have said that, right? Thank you for being honest. That's actually a theologically incorrect statement. And a lot of people in our churches kind of identify that way. And the statement isn't that you're not creative. The statement is that maybe you're not artistically gifted. Because some of us are. We can sing, we can write poetry, we can paint, and others of us know that we're not gifted that way. But that doesn't mean we're not creative. We look at the clouds and we see our own shapes. We dream up our own things that we want to eat. We plan our own vacations. Nobody ever delegates the naming of their dog, right? We are fundamentally creative, and that's a muscle or a capacity that we can exercise. But all of that understanding starts when you first take account of God and then understand the subject of creativity theologically, right? And so that's kind of what I think Proverbs means by the fear of the Lord, taking account of God first, is the beginning of wisdom or knowledge or understanding. So Richard Baxter, the Puritan, says this, that nothing can be rightly known if God be not known, nor is any study well managed, nor to any great purpose, if God is not studied. So what I really want to do tonight is try and take a little bit of history and a little bit of theology and wrestle with race and privilege, and then when we get into Q&A, we can chase it down any number of different paths. But that's really kind of my starting point and my orientation. Does anybody have the book and you can turn to like the lead-in quote to the whole book, like the most important quote to the whole book? You know what it is? I realized it when I was just pontificating about grad schools and theology and all that. I remembered this. I haven't been able to do this anywhere else because it wouldn't have meant as much. But someone want to read it? It's by a well-known theologian that hangs around Wheaton. Somebody have it?
If God made this world, why should it be a surprise that the things we believe about God connect us to the world He made?
Yeah. Vince Baycoat said that orally in a lecture I heard him give, and I flagged it because I thought it was so profoundly simple. And then I had to get permission, since it wasn't in writing anywhere, that he signed off on it. I don't know if you even remember that. You remember, okay. But read it one more time. Reflect on this, and then we'll jump in. But this is really what we're getting after. So go ahead, one more time.
If God made this world, why should it be a surprise that the things we believe about God connect us to the world He made? Okay,
so this is Westminster Abbey. I was there this summer. I took my daughter. I have 4 daughters. By the way, my wife Tamara is my best friend. The last couple of years, I've started stalking my wife. I come home from work and I ask her if I can go on errands with her, and if she says she's driving somewhere, I hop in the car, and I'm the best version of myself when I'm around her. So that's kind of like my favorite pastime now, is just hanging out with my wife. We have 4 daughters. One is age, stalking maybe wasn't the right phrase. If she was sitting here, so normally when I preach in church, I know where she's sitting, and she can control what I say before I even say it. So anyways, I did hear that myself in my head. My 4 daughters, I've got 4 girls. My oldest is Mary Joy. My second oldest, 14, is Esther, and then Sarah is 12, and then Aztln is 9. Aztln is such an extrovert that she talks to herself, she sings to herself. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen. She goes up to every stranger and just starts talking to them. We've been on elevators before. You get on at the 8th floor. It's really early in the morning. We cram into hotel rooms. I know, ethically speaking, I shouldn't have said that either. We're 6 people. You're only supposed to have 4. But so I don't sleep well in hotels. We get into an elevator, and a guy in a business suit will come into the elevator, and he'll be there with his briefcase, and my daughter Aztln will say, "Hi," and he'll say hi. And she'll say, what's your name? And then I'll say his name. Do you like this hotel? What floor are you staying on? Are you going to get breakfast? Are you staying here more nights? Where are you going next? And as you're going down the floors, we're just not even making eye contact. And you can see the businessman just trying to make eye contact with us, like, help, you know? And our attitude is like, we deal with this all day long. Like, this is your turn. You made the mistake to answer the first question, you know? But we do these rites of passage trips with our daughters. So we had the chance to take our third, Sarah, over to Europe because I had a consulting gig and it kind of covered a hotel room and helped with some things. And so we kind of snuck right into the back of Westminster Chapel, Westminster Abbey, as they were doing an organ concert. So this is off of my phone, and it's packed out, so we're all the way in the back. And it's late in the afternoon, lights coming through. Winston Churchill's grave marker is right when you come in the doors. So my daughter, because she's exhausted, is sitting on Winston Churchill's grave marker. My wife and I are there, and this organ concert's going on, and I'm trying to get my daughter's attention, like, really let this sink in, like, appreciate this. And 12-year-olds, when they're tired, beauty, you just, maybe not as much. But so I was looking at this and I was like, wow, this is such an example of Gothic architecture. And my theological mind started going. And the idea is we've got the transcendence of God and the immanence of God. The transcendence of God, that God is big and other and distant, and his ways are higher than our ways, right? And this architecture really paid homage to that, this idea of the bigness and the high ceilings and the light coming in and beauty. And when you had sound, that sound and the acoustics would lift you into a different place, out of the messiness of the world, and that you'd be able to commune with God kind of in a different kind of a way. And so it's a fascinating thing, and you go to the outside, and I remember in high school, the whole idea of flying buttresses, I never knew what it was other than to giggle at the word buttresses, right? Like, and so you get older and you go, it makes such sense, even though I'm not an architect, that somehow these things on the outside are holding up those walls and allowing them to go way up into the air and to have those windows, right? They hold them from falling out or falling in. Notre Dame, one of the best examples of these flying buttresses that kind of do that. And so I was in this place and listening to this music and just feeling kind of enraptured in this sense. And then as I walked out, I was really struck by something I didn't expect to see. And if you go to Europe, you have the cathedrals of Europe, and a lot of them go back 500 years, sometimes more, and you get really used to seeing statues that are in these alcoves all around. In fact, the David, when Michelangelo was doing it, one of the reasons it's shaped the way it was at one point in time he was thinking it was going to go on the Duomo in Florence. And so this is a common sight. This is now walking out, and if you turned around and looked back at Westminster Abbey, this is what you see. This is where all of the people have come and gone, where William and Kate entered when they did their kind of wedding that everybody watched, right? And when Queen Elizabeth got crowned queen some 600, 700, 800, 1,000 years ago, she being queen, I think she found the Holy Grail, and she's using it. But this is Westminster Abbey, where you've got this rich history, and I turned around and looked, and something caught my eye, and I felt like I recognized the second person from the left. And so I kind of got closer, and sure enough, it says king. And I thought, that's not what I expected. And that must be referencing Martin Luther King Jr., but that just doesn't make sense to me. And then I looked at the others, and they were equally kind of strange. And so I went looking for a placard. Anything historical, there's a placard somewhere, right? You just got to look for it. But sure enough, this is a wall of martyrs. And I read the story about this nun, and it was she was martyred and working with the poor, and it was kind of a Mother Teresa kind of a thing. And it was a new story to me. And then here was Martin Luther King Jr., and they had him here, and obviously his work with the civil rights movement and then being gunned down. And then next to him, Oscar Romero. Anyone know Oscar Romero's story? El Salvador, one of the early in people with what was known as liberation theology, which was really simply saying that the scriptures were written to people on the bottom, oppressed people. And since they were written to that audience, kind of from that perspective, in some ways we have to get back to hearing it that way. They weren't written by the elite or even in some ways for the elite. They were written kind of for the bottom. In fact, the Old Testament was primarily written by a group of people that had been just recently freed from oppression and slavery in Egypt. And a number of other books were written under the threat of the Babylonian captivity or the exile or possibly during that exile. And the New Testament written entirely by a group of people that were living under the occupation and the oppression of the Roman Empire. The Bible that we have, Oscar Romero was understanding it through the lens of the poor that he was working with. And because he was working against the oppression in his country, there's something like, you can Google me if you want. I always tell my students that I'm a high N on the Myers-Briggs intuitive. And so details are just kind of like scatter graph for me. And that's why we have Google. But there's something like 13 families that owned all the land in El Salvador. And imagine how you would have to try to work or even have the potential to try and navigate upwards in a country like that. And as Oscar Romero was dealing with this, he was gunned down during Mass in the 70s. And so he's on this wall. And then the person next to him, anybody able to read that name? Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I'm still going, this is crazy, Westminster Abbey and what's going on. And obviously Bonhoeffer, he was hung in the Flossenburg prison camp, I think literally 13 days before it was liberated, but roughly in that time frame before it was liberated by Allied forces, because he had been implicated in a plot to overthrow Hitler. And his activism to try and stand up against that is why he's on this wall. And I was really struck by the juxtaposition of this transcendence that I saw inside, and then these kind of justice advocates as I'm walking out. And as I'm reflecting on that, I got to the street, and the street in that area with not Buckingham Palace, Westminster, the seat of government, Westminster, right? Westminster, what's their parliament? Nobody here watches like The Crown or anything like that? It's Westminster, right? The government buildings. You're looking at those Westminster Abbeys right here. I think it's Westminster. And so you have the whole square, and in the concrete are these little medallion kind of things inlaid commemorating the Jubilee anniversary of the Queen. And just seeing the word Jubilee all of a sudden clicked something for me. And I thought, this is really interesting. And so Jubilee, here's Leviticus, that you're going to consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you is to return to your family property and to your own clan. Whatever has befallen you, that you go into debt or you become a bondservant, or you give up your kind of ancestral lands because you need to, whatever, that somehow there's this giant reset. Just think of what that says to that El Salvador situation, right? But there's this giant reset where the messiness of life, somehow we come back to and go, that's not the way God intended it to be. That's not the way it could be, should be, ought to be. And we're going to let this year be the year that we come back into equality and equity and fairness as a community that has concern for one another. And we do that every 50 years, which is some sense a generational thing. And it's called the Jubilee. Does anyone know this? Because the beginning of the Jubilee year starts on the Day of Atonement. It's really symbolic, isn't it? The Day of Atonement, when sins are forgiven, is when this kind of gets inaugurated, and it happens as the ram's horn is blown on the Day of Atonement. So the Hebrew language around that is what gives us the name of Jubilee. And so this was this kind of interesting thing that you have the transcendence of God but you also have the immanence of God, that God is in the messy things of reality. In fact, we're made out of the dust of the earth. In the Psalm book, we're about to come up on Good Friday, Jesus didn't say, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because somehow there's this really weird thing where everything went wrong, and God the Father that we're supposed to think loves us somehow vanished. Actually, I argue, Jesus was praying the Psalms. It's right there in the Psalms. And that psalm is about the messiness of life. And then it goes a couple verses into this grand kind of declaration that only God will save, even though I'm not experiencing His presence and I'm experiencing the worst that life has to offer. And as Jesus is on the cross in the worst situation possible, He's praying the Psalms, the original Book of Common Prayer. And He's teaching us that in some sense that God has ordained these prayers for all situations, and the darkest ones especially. And so I'm sitting here thinking about this, and I think it's a beautiful picture for us to understand that somehow, some way in our evangelical history, we allowed a false dichotomy to get wedged into the invisible spiritual otherness of God and the messiness and the humanness of life. And that God actually doesn't live with that divide in His soul, that God actually cares about both of these things. And that's why in Isaiah 58, when He's saying, you clamor for me at a prayer level, you fast for me that I would come near, you're doing the body motions, and you have this heart cry for intimacy. And He's saying, I understand that, but what I really want in terms of our relationship and to feel that closeness, for you to understand where I'm at, is that you would loose the chains of the prisoner, right? That you would clothe the naked, you would feed the hungry. In Matthew 25, where Jesus talks about doing this for the least, He borrows the same imagery and carries it forward and says, this is what it means to kind of be in relationship with me. I think this is important because it's tied to this conversation on race. That this conversation on race is an awkward conversation. It's a conversation that not all evangelicals know how to have. It's one that has really huge stakes in it. And if a false dichotomy is available to us, we will naturally compartmentalize it, sanitize it, and move it away from us like toxic waste so that we can inhabit the more comfortable parts of our relationship with God. And so we have to be willing to remove that wedge or that false divide in order to come back to a more robust, holistic understanding of the nature of loving God and loving others, and that this is what we're called to. So I want to give you just a couple of arguments of why the race conversation matters, and I want to say it more provocatively, why race matters in our gospel conversations. Why race matters in our gospel conversations. So a couple things. Because we, the church, have created the set of circumstances that we now inherit the fruit of. As you sow, so shall you reap. What we're experiencing in terms of the trauma in our culture today on so many levels is one that we worked hard to create in the first place. This picture, anyone want to guess where this picture was taken? It's taken in Portland, Oregon, where starting tomorrow, am a pastor. It's taken in Portland, Oregon. Ironically, Portland, Oregon, for a decade, had the highest per capita Ku Klux membership in the United States. In fact, in the 90s, it was where the skinhead neo-Nazi kind of revolution took place. We think of certain places in America as being white, and we kind of think, what does race really matter in a place like that? The question rather is, how did it become only white in the first place? And it became that way intentionally. Oregon had more exclusionary laws on the book than any other state. Exclusionary laws meaning that you were prevented from living there or working there or buying property there if you were a certain racial identity. And a couple of these, just for instance, there was a year period where you had to pay a tax. It was illegal for you, if you were an African American or mulatto, a person of color, to be working in Oregon And if you were working there, you had to pay the penalty of tax. And if you couldn't pay it, you could choose to be whipped. Even though you were a free person, choose to be whipped as a form of paying for that tax. It's well known that many towns in Oregon were what were called sundowner towns. In other words, don't be caught here after dark, which excludes you from the commerce of society, which puts you on the margins. How do you live? How do you raise kids in a society like that? Bend, Oregon, where I've been living for 14 years, is a destination location for a good bit of last year. It was the fastest growing city in America. For the last decade, it's one of the handful of cities in America that has been the fastest growing over a whole decade. People want to come live there. But the downtown of Bend, Oregon, I have a Native American friend in his 60s. He remembers going into downtown Bend when he was a kid and seeing signs in the window that said, "No dogs or Indians allowed." I told him that I thought that was so awful. And I really felt that experience and was trying to empathize with him. And I have a friend who's a spoken word artist by the name of Micah Bournet. He's out of Long Beach. He went to Moody, does amazing art. He lived in Bend for a while, and he was so popular that I made the mistake of saying to my Native American friend, like, "Listen, Bend has changed. It's like the crazy thing. If you're a minority here, it's like everyone wants to be your friend because it's an all-white town, and half this town, and I just thought I was making conversation. And he looked at me, and he was incredibly gracious and very gentle, and he kind of nodded his head and then said, 2 weeks ago, I came out of Starbucks, and I was walking down the street, and there was a group of teenagers, rather large, seniors, football players, whatever, and one of their moms was with them, and so it was a little bit of a group, and they were coming my way, and so they took up most of the sidewalk. So I kind of went to stand out of the way so they could pass, and one of them did one of those things where you pretend to trip, and he threw one leg behind the other and did a pretend trip, put both hands on me and threw me into the street. And they all laughed. And the mother, the older woman with them, laughed, and they kept walking. And that's all he said. And all I said was, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have presumed to know more than I know." Much of America, small towns, sundowner towns. These headlines aren't that old. In the late 40s, when suburban communities began, Levittown in New Jersey and outside of New York, purposely were created to focus on homogeneity, that everyone in this planned community needs to be at the same class, the same race, the same socioeconomic status, so that they feel safe, so that they experience it a certain way, so that we can put businesses in there that are highly targeted to those individuals, and that this whole thing actually works incredibly well. And so for much of the early suburban movement, it was actually on the books for real estate agents that it was unethical for them to put a person of color or an immigrant into a planned community like this. So when we're talking about structural racism or injustice, we're talking about state-sponsored racism, right? That it's written into codes, that it's written into laws and the things like this. So our national history, as a Christian, arguably a Christian nation for much of our history, this is what we did with our energy. This is Portland today. I heard that there were posters on campus at your college from a diversity group, and that had faces scratched out. It's easy to walk in the middle of the road and try and put up blinders and say it's not as bad as everyone wants to think it is. But there are other people that are looking at everything that's happening and feeling and experiencing that it actually is a country where we continue to try to perpetuate a normative standard that if you don't fit, then you are deemed to be, in some ways, other or a threat, or you're certainly not going to be feeling like you're welcomed into a safe and prosperous life track. It's still going today. Redlining. Who has not heard of redlining? Just raise your hand. So, interesting thing. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this quick. The history stuff matters. Redlining. Just think of the history now. When the Great Depression happens, 29, the stock market crashes, and we begin to get this run on banks, and the Great Depression gets kicked off. At that point in time, if you owed the bank money on your house, they could come and ask for that money at any point in time, and if you couldn't give it to them, you owed them their property, which was your house. One of the reasons everything came undone so quickly was because banks that were getting this kind of run on their money went to people that owned or owed them money and demanded that back. And then all of a sudden people are being pushed out all over the place, and there's really nobody to buy those things in some kind of a protected way, that they have money for the full amount of those houses. So when FDR comes in and he says, how do we never have that happen to us again, a Great Depression? They created the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, and they came up with this thing called the 30-year fixed mortgage loan, which is familiar to most of us. Our parents or ourselves, we've been in this. And the idea of the 30-year fixed mortgage is the mortgage can't change once you're locked in. And as long as you make your monthly payments, the bank can never come and just take that from you. So it creates stability over time. Does that make sense? But now the federal government is backing these loans. And so they want to know which loans are safe to back and which ones are at high risk of defaulting, or where the values will go down, and we don't feel comfortable backing those loans. And so they went around to most urban areas and cities, and they rated, oftentimes by silly things, like if you had a garden, not food, but like plants and flowers, that's the kind of thing that's going to be middle-class America and high value. If you have a garden and you have vegetables in it, you might be white trash, you might be something else. You're actually trying to use your land to feed yourself. That's high. Just silly things that went that way. Railroad tracks would literally separate different communities. But one of the things they used, criteria, was if there are immigrants there or people of color, that makes that community a high-risk community. And so it's going to get marked in red, which eventually became known as redlining. Okay? So GI Bill, people coming back from the war, on into the housing boom, suburban boom, all this. You had much of America accessing loans, 30-year fixed loans, to get into a housing market that became the great piggy bank of America for the 1900s. It's how you accumulated generational wealth. And you had other people in areas where they had to get loans from loan sharks, where they had to rent, they couldn't own property. And not only that, because that kind of investment money wasn't going into the houses in that area with those loans and backed by the federal government, that meant businesses weren't also showing up in those neighborhoods as well. And the decisions being made for schools, where do we build new schools, better schools, and invest that money, also wasn't going to those neighborhoods. And so when you wonder why the cities in America or the towns in America still look segregated, like, how did that come about? That came about intentionally through a form of state-sponsored racism, or the flip side of that, state-sponsored racial privilege that was accessible by a few people. So in some urban communities, we have what are called food deserts, that you're more likely to see a strawberry soda can than you are to see a fresh strawberry. And that we have this inequity that kind of still exists. This is Chicago, by the way. So it should look pretty familiar. You have what was Cabrini Green, kind of in the one area, and obviously was shut down as a part of urban renewal that way, and a lot of that moving into South Chicago. And you know this story better than I do, how some of the social challenges that creates that most of America doesn't understand, and that somehow this goes all the way back to the federal government and how it handled things in a way that was not only unfair, but radically unjust. So why do we have to talk about race? Because it's a part of our racial history. As Christians, it's a part of the racial history that we brought about in this country. The other reason, corporate confession. We need to talk about race because we can't say, well, I didn't do that. Like, that wasn't me. That was that generation. I didn't do that. Daniel is a great example of this. Daniel was too young to be guilty of sin when he was carted off to captivity in Babylon. But as he grows older and matures in wisdom and becomes this godly man, we see his prayers, and he prays these things like, Father, forgive us. We have sinned against you. We have transgressed your laws. We didn't protect the weak or the vulnerable. We didn't stand for justice. And he's always putting himself in that equation when it could have been easy for him to go, my forefathers. You saw, God, what they did, and it's not fair that the rest of us are here, but fix that, God. He's willing to take that all on and say, I bear some of that guilt as an Israelite, as someone that's in this. I think we have to get back to that as Christians, that our fundamental identity is not an individualistic one, but a communal one, a corporate one, where we look at it and we just lament the brokenness that we see in the world. Here's the argument, just in terms of logical consistency. Christians that come to me and say, I am not culpable for any of that. I ask them, are you saved by Jesus' death on the cross? And they'll say yes. So why do you need Jesus' death on the cross? Because of my sins. Where did that sin come from? And they'll usually say, well, Adam's sin, and through Adam, sin entered the world. So you think corporately we all inherited sin through Adam, and somehow you think corporately we all inherit forgiveness through the death of one person. So everything about your theology is a corporateness, yet on this issue, all you want to do is extricate yourself and say you stand in a vacuum as an individual that has never been touched by race in any kind of way, shape, or form. And there's a logical inconsistency. If we're going to take the earlier premises, we have to also realize the other one speaks to us as well. I'm going to move quick here. Change only happens when things are pushed. I'm sorry if you're from the South. I went to college in the South. The South never changed anything on race unless it was being pushed. The Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, Supreme Court decisions, even now when you talk about Confederate statues and the like, there's something about the nature of injustice, especially things that are deep in the structures, that prophetic stuff has to push into that. That's why when we read the prophets, their language is one of leaning into things. So it's required of us as Christians that justice matters and that we bear responsibility for pushing into it. Bad data has to be replaced. Why does this matter? The operating system we used to have has to be replaced. Bad data has to be replaced to be mature and wise and just individuals. It used to be that margarine was good. We now all know that margarine isn't good, right? My father-in-law, he grew up thinking that Jell-O salad was the same thing as salad. I still think he might believe that, but it's not the same thing as salad. You know, and we update our operating system periodically to get rid of bad data. And on this issue of race, we have to update things like, hey, I'm colorblind. I don't see race. We're all one, as Justin Timberlake once said. And I have a friend that wrote a book. I actually, acquaintance via many distances. I guess I wouldn't be able to claim friend, but Sarah Shin wrote a book called Beyond Colorblind. It's a wonderful book. You should pick it up. And she does a great job of tackling this right at the beginning and says, if you're the victim of sexual abuse as a child, and you now have that as a part of your story in adulthood, and you're coming to somebody and they're going to build a friendship with you, but they just don't know how to talk about that. It's really traumatic and really awkward, and they don't have the language for it, and so they say to you, you know what, that trauma makes me feel uncomfortable. Let's just set that to the side, and can't I just be friends with the rest of you? And she says, when you come to somebody and say, I'm colorblind, it's as if you're saying, I want to take your racial identity, the identity that God gave you, made in His image. I want to take the experiences you've had, all the good, the bad, and the ugly, and because I don't understand it fully or have the language for it or might not feel comfortable with it, I want to take your racial identity, set it to the side, and can't we just be friends with the rest of you? It just doesn't make any sense. Bad data, things like colorblind, have to be replaced with better things like God really wants us to be this beautiful mosaic that comes together. Revelation 7, 9 through 10, that we come around the throne of Jesus, every tongue, tribe, and nation. Tongue, language. Language is the bearer of culture. It's a multicultural expression that we're coming with different languages and in harmony adding to this chorus. And when we choose to value multiculturalism, the diversity that God kind of put on this earth now, we're getting a little taste of heaven before it's time. But if we say, no, we got to get rid of cultures and somehow assimilate all together into a monoculture, that's actually a different picture than the vision that we're giving in the book of Revelation. So we have to replace bad data with good. And then lastly, here's the gospel part. We have to talk about race because I truly believe that this is a part of the gospel. When God asks Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" and Cain answers, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" I actually think you're seeing a meta-narrative set up that takes its way all the way through Scripture. That in some ways, God, all through Scripture, is answering this statement of Cain and saying, yes, you are your brother's keeper. Whatever you don't do for the least of these, you actually are not doing for me. There is no place to stand where you're somehow outside of it all and in a vacuum. The good news is a light that fills the room. Jesus is the light that came into the world. He says a city on a hill can't be hidden. He says don't hide your light under a bushel. This idea of the good news being like a light I think is so powerful, but it's the nature of light to touch everything in the room, every corner. And when you say race or racial injustice or racial history, we're talking about probably the greatest injustice of the last 500 years. And if you tell me that the gospel doesn't have something to say to that, then my question to you is, how is the gospel good news? I mean, good news is actually good news after all. And if someone goes, no, but in our tightly parsed formula of good news, where we're talking about the transaction of substitutionary atonement, I don't see race coming into that. I'm saying you're so lost in the means of the gospel that you no longer see the ends of the gospel. We are saved by Jesus' death on the cross and forgiven so that God can reconcile all things to himself. Right? The end is the reconciliation of all things. The mechanism is the death of Jesus on the cross. And how does it injure the means for me to also talk about the ends? People think I'm somehow beating up on the cross. And I'm like, I don't think the cross is offended for me to talk about what the cross pointed to. I don't think Good Friday is offended for me to talk about Easter Sunday. Right? I don't think Jesus' body on the cross is somehow diminished when I talk about his body not being in the tomb. In fact, Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 15, right? If all we have is the death of Jesus but not the resurrection, then we're to be the most pitied of all people. That somehow it's about this newness of life that's coming about. I'll quickly make this argument, and then, because it's the gospel argument, it's important. Because this is where I get branded liberal. Because if you say anything about the cross, people have lost sight that the cross was a Roman torture device. We're so caught up in the Christian bookstore jewelry version of the cross that it really changes how we see things. But here's the thing. The cross was like the altar. In other words, in the temple, you had an altar, and then you had the holy place, the temple building itself, temple proper, and in that you had the most holy place, or what we called the Holy of Holies, right? And there was a 5-inch thick veil that separated the Holy of Holies from everything else. And on pain of death, we couldn't enter into that, except for the high priest, like once a year. Okay? Because God is holy, perfect, without blemish, and unholiness just can't mix with that. So people would come to the temple. They would bring animals. The blood on the altar would atone for sins, wash, so that we were, in some sense, cleansed, made more acceptable to a degree, so that we could get closer to the actual presence of God. That was the temple system. Now, Jesus is likened unto the Lamb. Behold the Lamb. that takes away the sins of the world, right? And he goes to the cross, and he even says that, here's my body, and here's my blood, that represents that early lamb in the Passover kind of meal. And he goes to the cross, and it's now him as the perfect sacrifice, his blood atoning, washing, cleansing our sins, so that we can come closer to God, right? Now, if the cross was all that mattered in our gospel story, when Jesus dies and the lightning flashes, the thunder roars, Garth Brooks sings, and you're on the Temple Mound, then what should happen to the altar? What should happen to the altar? Does C.S. Lewis have it right? Like in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the table on which Aztln was killed somehow is cracked because never again is that table needed for a sacrifice. Did the altar crack because never again is a sacrifice going to be needed to be given? And the answer is no, that's not what happened. If you were standing by the altar with your phone ready to Instagram this thing, nothing would have happened. It would have been really boring. What did happen? The temple veil was ripped in two from top to bottom, symbolizing that God himself, the author of our salvation, had once and for all removed the barrier so that we could be restored, reconciled, redeemed, saved back into a relationship with God, right? So the cross, serving as the altar for the forgiveness of sins, allows now for reconciliation. The means of the gospel, what? The cross of Jesus Christ. The end of the gospel, reconciliation. So when we're talking about relationship, when we're talking about these things, we have to understand that God is a God who ultimately is wanting to bring all things back into a reconciled state, the way he intended it to be in the beginning. And so when we look at our fellow man or woman and see that they're being excluded or discriminated against, we can't go, that's really bad, Wedge, but here's my relationship with God in a super spiritual way. God doesn't live with that wedge. God sees that. He's broken over that, laments that. Jesus showed us how he sheds tears over it and somehow wants us to be the hands and feet of Christ, that we now are the incarnation, the body of Christ, going into this world, giving our lives up, in some sense symbolically shedding our blood to help other people find a place back into shalom and justice and goodness and where they're supposed to be in the relationship with God in the community of saints. Reconciliation is at the center of this good news. Does race belong in our gospel conversation? It can't be good news if you say somehow race does not belong in our gospel conversation. That's my assertion here. We're going to take questions now. That was a little longer than kind of what I thought, but we've got plenty of time for Q&A. And anything is valid on the table. We can chase it down. And I'll try and repeat your question just so that everybody can hear it. But if someone will get us started so that we don't waste that 2 minutes of awkward, not a first question time, we'll just jump right into it. Yes, sir.
I had a question from early. You talked about the Jubilee and how can the church in America practice Jubilee? Probably a whole lesson.
Yeah. So the question is, how can the church in America practice Jubilee? I think it really just comes down to American individualism. You know, the American dream is predicated on me thinking about myself, trying to move upwardly as quick as I can, as far as I can, and that the more I enmesh myself in the lives of others, the more that prevents me from upward mobility. And so I think until we kill that idol of the American dream, by the way, the American dream is nothing but just different language of talking about the prosperity gospel. God somehow wants everything to get better and better and better and better and better for me, and I get really confused when I get a report of cancer, right? Or some, you know what I'm saying? Like when things go backwards, it's like somehow God is broken. The mechanism isn't working right. It's an idol. And I think we have to kill that idol. It's in all of us. I have been marked and shaped by the prosperity gospel, even though I've never set foot in a church that would say they ascribe to it. It's just in our language. everywhere. It's the way we raise our kids. By the way, we did something in the 40s and 50s called the melting pot. We were really excited about ourselves after World War II. We had kind of fixed the world. Please help me here. So much horrific stuff happened in World War II. My dad was a Dutch immigrant, and he's taught me story after story after story of that horror. So I'm gonna try to acknowledge that and say, but the role that we played and what happened to our economy of being supercharged after World War II, the rise of religion that happened in that period as we were pitted against Russia, the atheists, in the Cold War. By the way, In God We Trust on our dollar bill came onto our dollar bills in the 50s under Eisenhower. It's a real big boom kind of in American spirituality. And in this, we wanted to look at ourselves and see ourselves as one entity, Americans. And instead of like we used to see each other before World War I as Germans, Italians, Irish, Scottish, French, whatever. And so the idea was we're one melting pot where we've come together and lost those different ethnic or cultural identities. And out of that, we've emerged as one. By the way, it was always white amalgam called American. This new thing. My dad immigrated in 53 and bought into this so quickly. He wanted to shed that kind of immigrant experience or to be seen that way and got pulled into that great melting pot, right? So here's the interesting thing. If you tell people to get rid of their ethnicity, with it goes culture. And people, we're human beings made in the image of God. We need culture to kind of identify ourselves and to kind of know how we get along with people. So all of a sudden you've got this interesting new thing, this kind of melting pot. Well, what's the culture that goes with being American? And I'm going to really oversimplify it, but the answer was football, fast food, and consumerism. And so you've got a lot of people in the angstiness that you see in a lot of middle-class white youth, that sense of not knowing where they fit or belong. No traditions to kind of anchor into. They've been suburbanized so much that they don't even identify with greater family or community or culture. And I think what we created was something incredibly unhealthy. And so I think, how do we practice Jubilee? We have to reverse kind of that strong individualistic impulse and then lean back into the value of community and the cultures that come with that, extended family and beyond, and say, if one part of the body suffers, so do I. And what I sow is what I'll reap. So if I care about your issues, you know what? Someday you're going to care about mine, and that's what the body of Christ should look like. Those are just a couple ideas, but that's a big question. Property rights are a hard one to navigate. Yes, sir.
When you look at the 7 deacons in Acts as Greek, how do you think do you think that's prescriptive or descriptive?
I think it's logical. So the question is, how do I look at the deacons in Acts? So just in case you're not familiar with it, you have this beautiful picture of Acts 2. Every church loves to talk about it. We don't like to talk about a couple chapters over where the dysfunction comes out. And the dysfunction was an ethnocentric dysfunction. The Hebrew Jews were discriminating against the Greek-speaking Jews. And those widows weren't getting the alms. And the apostles, you remember this? The problem comes to them and they say, this is a problem, but one that we can't deal with. We need to multiply. And so they pick deacons. The most famous of is Stephen. The interesting thing is in the Greek text, it's very clear, Stephanos. Stephen was a Greek, arguably a Greek-speaking leader of the church. And so it's logical that when you have a problem with this language set and these people that are on the margins, that you kind of task a leader that understands their culture, speaks their language, to try and go and navigate into that and to kind of work with them. The more interesting thing is what comes out of that. Stephen ends up giving a pretty strong sermon, but so did Jesus. Jesus gave a lot of strong sermons. Ultimately, Jesus was put to death by the Romans. He was never stoned by the religious authorities of his day. Okay? As much as he was threatened, he never actually was stoned. Here you have a Greek Jewish leader who gives a harsh sermon, and this time he's actually stoned. Peter wasn't stoned, James wasn't stoned, John wasn't stoned, Stephanos was stoned. And then the persecution breaks out, and everybody goes, and we know that somehow in some ways this is when the Greek church gets folded in up in Antioch, and they have to write back and say this version of the gospel that we're preaching, we need it baptized and sanctioned by the leaders of the church. And they write that letter not to where the leaders are in hiding in some other country. They write that letter to where the leaders are in Jerusalem. James and John and Peter living in Jerusalem despite the persecution. Why? Because culturally speaking, they have connections there. They speak the language. They understand the culture. They have relationships in that city. And you begin to realize that this idea of the fault lines that emerge along race and class and language are fault lines that have always existed and that have always plagued the church. And that when we begin to realize, wow, we see this even in Scripture, that this is not just a side issue or a new issue today. This is an issue that in many ways kind of defines how we're going to embrace this new ethic of neither Gentile nor Jew, slave nor free person, nor man nor woman, that somehow we truly are all in Christ, despite language, ethnicity, culture, because we've been somehow transcending those fault lines that are a part of our fallen man that exists there. So I think it is logical, prescriptive, descriptive, informative, and a beautiful reminder for us that I never learned that part of Acts in seminary. I learned it from a 75-year-old Latino pastor in New York City. That we don't do a good job of talking theologically as it meets the messy reality that we see on the ground. Yes, sir?
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for coming to speak here. I think in the fight for justice, we need more allies on all sides of the aisle. And one thing that I've noticed with these type of lectures about race and justice is that oftentimes three types of students who come. The first type are students who are compassionate towards the fight. Number two are students who might have questions about race. And number three are students who come because the professors require it for a certain class.
Nobody hears that kind of category.
And I've noticed that some of my friends who are kind of retired talking about race do not attend these lectures, and I think if they did, it would answer a lot of questions that they have, but just because of the initial thought process, they kind of say, oh, it's just going to be another lecture blaming white people for things that they didn't do, like you just answered so beautifully. So my question is, how do we get more students who kind of almost want nothing to do with this conversation to come to these lectures to hear what you have to say?
That's a great question. How do we get more students to engage this that are finding natural ways to absolve or push away? Let me give a couple things real quick, just to name them. White fragility is real. It is. And if I was a leader of color right now and I was saying the exact same things I'm saying, the level of tension in this room would be a lot higher. And that fragility, it's like a circuit breaker. That white evangelicals have been trained that you can only take so much before it's like, that's enough. You're coming across too angry now. Or you said a word that made me feel like you were implying redistribution of wealth. Or you said that you like Obama. And you know what I'm saying? Any person of color, even if they disagreed with Obama's politics, should like Obama for a lot of reasons. You know what I mean? So it's some strange stuff. I had someone leave my church because an African-American pastor friend of mine pulled up to stay at their house and had an Obama sticker, and they surmised that Obama can't be a Christian because he didn't talk against abortion, and if these people are promoting Obama, then they can't be Christians. We're talking about an African-American pastor that's excited about a black Christian president, right? But we have this kind of point where the circuit breaker goes, and then white audiences don't bounce back. Once that thing triggers, it's like the circuit breaker. It's gone. You're done. You shut down, right? And so that's why That's why I'm standing here with the hope that 5 years from now, I wouldn't have a single place that would want me to come talk about race, because it's not needed anymore. But right now, allies are needed. It's most of my friends that are leaders of color are going, please, would there be some white person that'll talk louder than the minorities, just so the minorities can actually take a break for once, and not have to always carry the weight of pushing that conversation forward, right? But white fragility is real, and I think we have to, as white leaders, begin to call that into question and say, you don't just get to shut off on adult conversations. You know, I can't do that at the dinner table. Like, my wife's talking to me about something, and I'm like, yeah, I'm done. I don't like how you're making me feel. You know what I'm saying? Like, but we've allowed this to kind of be a thing, right? So white fragility is real. When you touch a hot plate when you're a child and you get burned, you learn real quickly, hot things burn me. And every time you don't touch something hot to find out logically if it's going to burn you, you create a shortcut in your brain. Your brain does this naturally for you. We would drive ourselves crazy if we didn't have those shortcuts. So now it's on the stove is on, I see steam, I don't touch it, right? My mind already knows. I don't even have to think about that. By the way, that's where implicit bias hides. When I walk down a street and I see a certain demographic of people or a lot of them walking, I don't logically go, is there a danger there? Somehow I find in myself that fear has arisen. Where did that come from? From movies? From socialization? From living in segregated areas? But that's what I have to begin to weed out and go, that little shortcut in my brain, that's actually not a godly shortcut, right? When you say that people don't come to lectures like this, they're going to make me feel guilty, they're going to blame it on white people, that's a political shortcut that they've been given by uncles, grandparents, certain news channels, and it works, right? Like input, output, racial thing, yeah, I know what that's going to be, output, right? But they're not actually thinking it through logically. So we as a community, as a culture, have to begin to shine the light on that and say, that's not okay. You actually don't know what's going to be said, and you're already assuming that you're somehow mature. How did you get to be so mature about race when you've never studied it, never read a book on it, never really cared about it, never made it central or priority in your life, don't actually have any friends of color that are interacting with you? How do you profess to have so much maturity that you already know the outcome to be able to excuse yourself from that lecture, right? Like, we have to begin to shine the light and say there's something dysfunctional going on in you. Here's the real danger that I see going on that troubles me. As a generality, what I see is people of color in the United States are on an incredible fast track of learning. Social media, the things that are being written, the scholars that are out there, the conversations that most of the people I interact with, students of color, people of color, are exploding with knowledge and language in this area of race and the history of race in America, with mass incarceration, immigration, refugees, xenophobia. They're learning so much. Do you see that, right? Because it's important to them, and there's so much wealth of resource there. Here's what scares me is that white evangelicals, by and large, are moving very slowly in the growth of our knowledge in this area. A lot of white evangelicals are turtled up and defensive, and the ones that are mildly open to it are slowly tiptoeing in and slowly kind of moving forward. And then there's some that are actually reading a book or two here or there, but comparatively speaking, this is moving really slow. And when you get PhD people someday, I'm talking like symbolically, a wealth of knowledge and information and language, and you've been in those conversations so much that you don't have to retrace everything, right? You just jump to kind of where the meat is at. When you have PhD people and you throw elementary school kids in the room, after a while you're like, this just isn't a meaningful conversation. I'm not enjoying this conversation, right? Like, that's why we have a kid table and an adult table, right? The danger here is that if white evangelicals don't recognize the time we're living in right now and get become willing to be different than our forebears that we always like to blame as the ones that were racist, and actually say, I've got to do some serious catch-up work. If we don't do that, we're going to be relegated by our own actions or inactions to the kiddie table, and now all of a sudden we're going to have less dialogue between people of color, dominant culture, whatever you want to call it. And so you bringing that up is exactly true, that the people that sometimes need it most, we have to encourage them to get to places and put social pressure on them that says it's not okay just to give a cheap answer and push it away. Yeah.
So, in response to that, and thank you very much, because it is refreshing to hear someone who's white actually entering into the conversation and being bold as you are, and being vulnerable as you are. What practices you put in place to avoid the potential of becoming like a white savior complex, or losing sight of those who you've joined alongside in your research or in your advocacy?
Yeah, so the question is, what do I have in my life? And I don't know that I'm the perfect example. I'm learning, as I go, obviously. I think we all are on a journey that way. The minute we think we've arrived, that's going to become problematic. But what's in my life to make sure that I don't fall into white savior or lose touch with the communities that I'm in? I just moved from a city that's predominantly white to a church that's heavily multicultural. And a big part of my wife and I feeling like God was calling us into that was to root ourselves in community, in a place that's working this out in day-to-day life, not theoretically, but practically, and to have our kids in that environment. My youngest, is going to go to an elementary school in the fall where she's the minority. And so I think it has to become important that way. We go on vacation with an African-American family friends of ours. We prioritize that, even when we don't have the money. Went on a credit card, which is not good Dave Ramsey, but it's really good race stuff. But it's like that's where we're putting our priorities, to be in community with people that, as they're sharing their experiences and we're sharing ours, that we're always, by the way, strong white evangelical leaders are very confident. We're a very confident entity. And we trust our intuitions very readily. And I think what I've been taught by my friends who are leaders of color in the Christian space is that, Ken, you need to not always trust your intuitions. And you need to filter things through leaders of color that are going to bring a different perspective to it than you. I was with a group of students yesterday, 30 students at Wheaton, and someone was asking me about coming back after experiencing a lot of things and being frustrated with evangelicals, and how do I go back into these evangelicals that I'm so frustrated with? And I said, you've got to find some leaders of color and put yourself underneath them, and here's why. They've been dealing with that frustration for as long as America's existed. And their traditions and their churches have helped them hold in tension the frustration with people that are acting in a way that in some sense is so un-Christ-like, and they can see it so clearly, but that they themselves, as they're working on that, still have to find Christian community and learn to worship and learn to receive what God would give in terms of daily bread and daily blessings. And that angstiness of being kind of a white evangelical that's frustrated with other white evangelicals, in some sense has to be tempered and be filtered through people that have more maturity than we do, right? White savior, here's the hard thing for me. I come into this room, and there are going to be white people in this room that are going to not like me. My greater insecurity is that the people of color in this room would not like me. I'm not doing this to try and feel good about myself. And in fact, oftentimes I come in with fear and trembling that maybe I'm going to do more harm than good. Maybe I'm going to say something that might offend somebody, because there's a lot of power by standing up and giving a talk. And so I think I've had to overcome the white savior thing in a different way than most people think, that I had to become okay if people put that label on me, as long as I know that that's not what my motive is, right? Because there needs to be people like me, white pastors, saying to people like you, don't travel to Africa and take an Instagram picture of yourself with 30 African kids huddled around you. Because if you didn't go to your church this Sunday, where there are hundreds of kids, and go put yourself around 30 of those kids and take an Instagram picture, then there's something more than just the kids that's going on in that Instagram picture. There's the power differential that exists or emerges, even if you don't realize it, with your face being in the middle of either that poverty or that racial dynamic that's happening there. And so I know there are things that need to be said. So even if I'm accused of something I'd never want to be accused of, I've had to be okay with that. I know my friends, and I know that they know kind of what my motives are. That's a great question, and feel free to call me on anything, anytime. Right here. Comment or a question?
I'm older than her. I'm always in the meeting when Martin Luther King was getting shot. He never heard one thing about that. He looked at the all the news, what they were doing, trying to get him. The only thing that makes me feel good, I don't think as soon as you got here, really good. But at that time, with the Jewish, was the
Marching with the civil rights march.
going down to Mississippi and just killing. And we didn't never talked about it.
Yeah. So the comment's a really good comment, and it's a comment about the civil rights movement, and that when that movement was going on, that there weren't things being shared in the old guard evangelical churches. In fact, the people that those people were marching against were arguably the evangelicals. I've read so many sermons and papers by pastors in those eras that, forgive me if you're Southern Baptist, I once thought if I was a Southern Baptist, I would probably at about 1 a.m. go firebomb our headquarters just to, accidentally burn up the historical records of all of that racism, right? That was an unreflective thought. So if you disagree with that or if that sounds wrong, that's okay. But I think that's what we have to realize is, in some sense, I once heard a historian get asked, how come you're not talking about the Christians with regard to the British abolitionists? It was Adam Hochschild, who's a brilliant historian, not a Christian, out of Berkeley. And he was asked by a Christian that was trying to trap him, said, how come you're not giving Christians credit for ending the slave trade as part of the abolition movement in England? And he just looked really perplexed, and he said, who did they end it from? And so from his perspective, he was like, the slave trade was perpetuated by Christian governments. In fact, the British Foreign Mission Society owned slaves in Barbados and branded them with a big S on their chests for society. The Foreign Mission Society. And so you're exactly right. We've landed in certain arenas of the church where that wedge existed and blocked us from understanding the greater humanity, and I think therefore understanding God's heart into it. And Martin Luther King Jr. is a phenomenal case study. And this is a bit dicey, but I know the environments I grew up in, and I'll tell you, and those of my generation, you tell me if it's not true. The most dominant thing I heard and was taught about Martin Luther King Jr. growing up was that he was a philanderer and therefore not a true pastor. That was what I was taught about Martin Luther King Jr. I was taught the J. Edgar Hoover version of Martin Luther King Jr. and never shown any of the other things. If you read his writings and look at some of the sacrifices he made and what he was able to do, we celebrate a lot worse men in Washington, D.C. and monuments than that. And my African American friends are appalled when they go, that's what you learned? That this man was standing up and putting his body on the line for us, and instead of being pulled into that story of justice, you were pulled into gossip and hearsay, you know. And so I think you're right also about this next generation. The comment was that he doesn't think that could happen the same way again because he sees something really beautiful with what's known as the justice generation or your generation. And I agree. I think your generation has grown up in a much more diverse culture. You have friends across the aisle in different kinds of ways. You empathize with the things you see on social media. And it doesn't mean that any generation is somehow inherently better than another one, but you have a much greater head start, I believe, hopefully, to live out a different multicultural reality with equality than maybe some other generations had. And so I pass along that affirmation that he had. There was a question here, and then we'll go over there.
Yeah, well, it's mostly of a comment back to the...
We're just doing comments now. Everybody, feel free to... I'm just kidding.
It's just about the white savior quote. I think that we really need to be discerned on that issue, because I think like that 2 arrow you point out is very important right now, because this is the age of discernment. If you see that most of the people that see this trend of going backward to an era that, you know, the people should be segregated again due to this presidency right here. It's really the time that one day the Lord will ask you, are you the sheep or are you the goat? Remember, there are 2 sides that he turned to them and talked. And so I really give these 3 cheers and whoever is here that has a heart to speak out for those people who are persecuted even in this country. Because I have been praying for a long time for the Christians who are being persecuted and those people who are being persecuted. And here we have a society that is so advanced now that most people who recognize these persecution are actually non-Christian. And this is when we need to ask the question, where are we?
It's a moment.
And do not be bothered by this white savior mentality, because it is a possible accusation from Satan and ask you to be quiet. And you cannot take that.
Well, let me just say a few things on the white savior thing that I think will help us in terms of distinction. And I hear what you're saying, that there's an opportunity here to lean into kind of the historical and systemic issues so that we don't return to a point of division again. How many of you saw the movie The Help? Remember that? So 1950s story, you've got this kind of awful woman, right, you know, that is leading this movement to take and put outhouses outside of their houses for the help, so that they wouldn't use the bathrooms inside the house and somehow contaminate them. And so this whole movie is kind of around this campaign this woman is leading to create these outhouses, and the help would then not use the interior bathrooms. And this same woman that you're beginning to just see the wickedness in her heart, there comes a fundraiser. You remember this? They're doing a fundraiser where they're auctioning their furs, her and the other women. And they're going to auction the furs. They come together at this country club. They're doing a dinner. And all of the help, people have employed their help to come and put this dinner on. And so all of the help is lined up. And the woman this bad woman looks to her help that she's been tormenting in this movie. And as she's saying, we're gonna sell all these furs, raise this money so that we can give it to the poor people of Africa, she looks over to this woman and says, you of all people should appreciate what we're doing here. White savior is often the pernicious thing when we jump over the injustices all around us that we actually have a responsibility to somehow deal with. And in turning a blind eye to that, we like to go to places where we can kind of plop in for a week or 2, or it's exotic or very different, or in some sense, once it's done, and we can go back to normal life. And in doing that, we let ourselves feel like we're somehow changing the world or doing this missions or saving these people. And when you really look at it, we're selling furs and giving it to the poor people of Africa and completely missing how this actually says something to the blindness that we have with the systemic issues right around us. So I think that, yes, white people need to stand up and not be afraid of being labeled things and speak for justice. Always speak for truth. Always speak truth to power. Always trust that somehow if you upset the ecosystem, that if you're doing it for the right reasons and you're doing it in humility, that God will be your rear guard. Always, always trust that. But be very careful of the cheap ways of getting at justice, which is really not about justice, but about dispensing compassion and then getting the hit somehow emotionally of feeling good that we've done something that way. And that's been the characteristic flaw, I think, of the evangelical church, is that we travel to somehow go and do this, but never actually roll up our sleeves and deal with the people around us that really need us to stand with them and fight alongside them for the basic human rights that should be afforded to citizens in this country. So just that distinction, yes, and be careful with that. We're going to hit them real quick because we're going to run out of time in like 5 minutes. Yeah.
Do you see conservative economic policy and racial reconciliation as mutually exclusive?
You know, I'm a white guy that thinks I know everything, but I'm going to rein myself in on this one and say that's a really complex question. We're given way too many binaries. Trump, Hillary, capitalism, socialism. Like, you know what I'm saying? Way too many just either ors when we're talking about very complex things that if you took the smarter people of our society, they would really parse out in very complex and nuanced ways that I don't think would fit those labels, right? So I think in some sense I'd push back on the question and say I wouldn't want to perpetuate that either or mentality. I'd want to say that we got to get to the place where we're accepting the complexity of that and trying to actually have those conversations, which only happens when we stop trading barbs back and forth across the Thanksgiving table, politically, right? It's a really good question. I think it's beyond my pay grade. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so it seems that racial justice is deeply embedded in society, and one of the things that you mentioned in the book is that we have to try to eliminate biases against the other. So what do you think that how will this help?
This conversation right here tonight?
No, the eliminating bias.
Well, so the question is, how does eliminating bias help the overall conversation around injustice in society? I think it has to not necessarily stop with our human heart, individual human heart, but if it doesn't somehow also start with our individual human hearts, then we're really not going to be able to bring much good to this conversation. So we all carry around with us a certain bias. Studies show that even people of color have interesting implicit bias up against people of color, right? And society has shaped us all in interesting ways. And so we have to learn to pay attention to the little voice that says stuff to us, and we're like, wait a second, where'd that come from? I could give some examples. I don't know that I want to, it's late in the day and I've had a long day. I don't know that I want to out myself on all my internal conversations I've had over the last couple of years and some of the data that I've mined. But I think we have to pay attention to that and slowly begin to rewire. Wait a second, why did I just think that? Why did I just say that? And let me go through logically and maybe recreate a different thing so that next time it doesn't go to that default, it goes to a different default. But we have to do the internal work because it ultimately comes to a quality that we have in our hearts first that then shows up in our relationships and then shows up in the things that we're creating like nonprofits or when we're choosing boards of directors or when we're hiring faculty or when we're, you know what I'm saying? It starts here and then barrels outward. So I think that issue of bias is incredibly important. Last question. Yes, ma'am.
Tough one. I am attending an multicultural church, and I'm trying to figure out what is the main work for us to do. Like, is it to have these conversations where we talk about race and culture, and people be able to flesh out what's going on inside them? Or is it to set up a committee that goes out and handles some of the social injustice? Or is it what we're doing now, just sitting quietly and listening to lectures and trying to figure out what to do?
Personally, I love education. I think biblically speaking, Jesus was a rabbi. He's a grad professor that had students. The word disciple just means learner. That's a Greek word. It means learner. Plato had disciples. Aristotle had disciples. Jesus had disciples. He taught them different things. But learning is at the core of who we are. So I think the minute we cut off this, we cut off some of the nourishment that ought to go to other places. So I never try and beat up on the talking part, but I think you're right. We have to look at what does the walking part mean. I think we're enamored with causes in the evangelical church, which is about doing justice. The Bible talks just as much about being just. That justice is something that should characterize me, not just a little lane I run in with regard to trafficking or regard to the environment, but somehow something that begins to color or texture my interaction with other human beings. And I think that what really needs to happen in churches is voice and power, and then how that ends up shaping the programmatic output. So we're really big, let me just say, we're really big on diversity in America. It's really hard to get, but it's kind of the big thing that every church wants, but it stops there. Like, we want to see diversity. This room's diverse. What we want of the church in America is we want to see diversity. We don't want to hear it. The minute we start hearing it, all of a sudden it's like, oh, you don't like Hillsong music? Like, really? But that's what we do. You mean you think that all our pastors are hipster? Well, but that's kind of who we are. And what's implied is we really liked having you here, or we really like having you here because we like seeing it, but we don't really want to hear, right? And the minute a church is willing to hear, it begins to rearrange the furniture in the living room. The furniture in my living room aims at the TV. You know that I value Netflix. I have African and Asian friends that if they came over and I said, rearrange the living room, they would quickly get rid of that TV and move the furniture to point towards the center, and I would quickly realize, like, oh, relationship and community, you've made space for a lot more people. The minute we let people have a voice and to bring themselves to the power conversation, it changes the way the furniture is arranged. And there's a lot of pastors and a lot of churches that are kind of afraid of that. So I think what we're looking for is we're looking to get to leaders and have them be in this conversation enough to where they begin to go, you know what? I'd rather it be we, and I'd rather go together than to just make it a monocultural expression that somehow gets results that aren't really about discipleship, but about kind of the lights and the kapow and the numbers. And they're going to create space for those voices. And in that, as the power dynamics are changed, the priorities and the values slowly begin to change as well. We're singing some lament songs, not just all joy songs, which seem to work better after a shooting. A lot better. Because that's what the church needs when we are listening to the evening news, kind of going back to this, right? And you know what? We're not just doing all trafficking because it's the soup du jour of the evangelical church. We're also going and partnering in this area, And so I really think it's about, if you're sitting in that church, voice, and then is that being allowed to kind of change the power dynamics, which ultimately changes some of the values and priorities and how that gets expressed. And that hasn't happened. So there was a big New York Times article, I don't know if you saw it, called The Silent Exodus, Why African Americans Are Leaving Evangelical Churches. And the whole article was one sustained argument saying that they were brought in and given place to sit at the table, but through all these different shootings and through the election and through everything that's happening, that a big part of this demographic was saying, wait a second, you actually aren't hearing us, you're not seeing us, you're not feeling us. In fact, you're not really wanting us to bring ourselves to this. And if you're not wanting us to sit at the table, then we need to go find a place that's safer, that we can be a part of, that actually is going to take our whole experience and let that be a part of the spiritual conversation of that community. And that's back to this. It's a really sad thing that in some places we're going backwards with regard to all of the diversity focus that we've had for a very long time. So we all have to lean into this if it's going to go the right way. Hey, thank you for hanging in there and being hot and all that. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.